Catherine sat before the camera last week and did something the palace almost never permits. A carefully prepared script lay in front of her, polished by communications staff and reviewed by advisors until every clause was smooth and safe. She read it once, she considered it, then she turned the pages face down and spoke about her youngest son in her own language. No notes, no prior clearance, no advance notice to the household. She cried while speaking, not at the beginning but roughly two-thirds of the way through a sentence concerning Louis. She continued without pausing, which proved more affecting than a complete collapse would have been. Kensington Palace does not traffic in the unscripted. It does not traffic in visible tears. For more than a decade, every public reference to the three children has been arranged, cleared, and timed. That is not cynicism, it is deliberate institutional policy. The relevant question is not the content of what Catherine said. The relevant question is what finally compelled a woman of such discipline to speak at all. Something had been unfolding inside the family for months. The country registered its outline without grasping its cause. Engagements quietly cancelled. Schedules altered at short notice. A boy who simply ceased to appear. No explanation was offered. The press office met every inquiry about the youngest Wales child with the same 4 words about family privacy. That silence was intentional. William constructed it, defended it for years against internal warnings that it would eventually fail, and watched it fail in the precise manner no one inside the building had anticipated. The policy itself is older and more deliberate than casual observers assume. George was born in 2013. Within a year, William and Catherine had settled upon an approach to their children's public lives that has remained essentially unchanged. Contemporary reporting has accurately described it as a 10-year determination to allow those children ordinary childhoods. The decisions concerned frequency of appearance, age thresholds, and the company in which they would be seen. The results have been visible for years, yet rarely examined. The 3 children appear only a handful of times each year. Christmas at Sandringham, an occasional balcony, a carefully selected sporting fixture. Photographs are released by their mother on her own timing, rather than captured by others, because a released image cannot be sold. William constructed this system for reasons that have little to do with contemporary media strategy and everything to do with a single Saturday in September 1997. He was 15. He walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London while the world watched. Within a fortnight, every private possession of Diana's had become public property. Letters, handwriting, clothing, recorded conversations never intended for wider ears. At 15, William learned precisely what this country does with the intimate details of a royal life once it obtains them. For nearly 30 years, he has worked to ensure that his own children remain beyond that reach. Every closed door in the present story originates in that earlier one. The eventual reversal of that long effort is the central irony of what followed. Louis is 8, the youngest of the 3, and therefore the least defined in role and the most protected in practice. George, at 13, carries a future that can already be described in institutional terms. Charlotte, at 11, has grown into a measured public presence. Louis has been held back. For a considerable stretch of the present year, he was held back entirely. Penciled appearances were removed. Family events he had previously attended proceeded without him. The pattern became consistent enough that close observers began counting months, producing precisely the speculation the policy had been designed to prevent. The policy itself deserves fair assessment before its failure is examined. For a decade, it succeeded more completely than most acknowledge. George reached the age of 9 with only a handful of public appearances. Charlotte has never had a school photograph sold to a newspaper. No long-lens image exists of any of the 3 children in ordinary childhood distress. Compare that record with the experience of William and Harry by the same age, when they formed a standing feature of the national press with photographers stationed at school gates. William achieved this against considerable internal pressure. It remains among the most consequential acts of his public life. The pain of the present story lies in the fact that what ultimately failed was not a careless error but his most careful achievement. The decisive moment occurred during a private rehearsal at Windsor. Catherine later identified it as the point at which she could no longer maintain the previous line. The session was intended to be gentle, a practice in an empty room without crowds or cameras, so that the boy might learn where to stand and how to move without public scrutiny. Midway through the morning, Louis stopped, took his mother's hand, and asked whether he was allowed to be seen, not whether he wished to appear, whether he was permitted. Catherine knelt, took both his hands, and later told 2 people that she could find no sentence that was simultaneously true and reassuring. William cleared the room of all but essential household staff, and sent George and Charlotte to another part of the residence so that neither would witness their brother's question. The temperature inside the household altered permanently that morning. Everything that followed was reaction. William's immediate response was absolute. He suspended every engagement involving Louis and declined further discussion. One missed ceremony, he argued, was negligible beside a child who had begun to conclude there must be a reason for his exclusion. The instinct is difficult to fault. It was also the moment the arrangement began to unravel. Senior aides warned that repeated absences would generate questions. In royal practice, an engagement is an official duty logged and published months in advance. When a member of the family ceases to appear, the absence becomes a matter of public record rather than rumor. A diary is sufficient. No internal source is required. The advisors sought a brief, controlled statement that would allow the press office to answer with a document rather than silence. Their concern was practical rather than cynical. They had watched the same pattern unfold with Catherine herself in 2024, when an unexplained gap in the schedule produced months of damaging speculation before the palace finally spoke. They were not asking William to expose his son. They were telling him that an empty space does not remain empty and that others will fill it on terms the family cannot choose. William refused, repeatedly and for months. He would not convert his son's situation into public narrative while the child remained uncertain and frightened. 30 years of personal evidence supported his caution. He was correct about the danger and incorrect about the remedy. The distance between those two judgments constitutes the entire story. The silence did not remain confined to Louis. It moved through the household and reached the other two children before either parent recognized the extent of its spread. George, at 13, is old enough to sense that something is wrong and young enough to believe it is his responsibility to absorb it. He grew quieter, more careful, more helpful. Both parents interpreted the change as evidence of successful coping. One night he asked his father whether a younger brother could be kept entirely out of public view without anyone beyond the family knowing. The question was not about protocol. It was an attempt to determine whether the silence signaled ordinary caution or something more serious. Charlotte, at 11, responded differently. She registered every closed door, every conversation that altered direction when she entered a room, every lowered voice. No one explained. She constructed a reasonably accurate picture nonetheless, as children of that age frequently do. She began leaving handwritten jokes beside her brother's bed with quiet regularity. She had observed that laughter returned him briefly to himself, and she set about producing that effect deliberately and without announcement. When she later overheard staff discussing growing external attention, she sought her mother and asked whether strangers were now worried about her brother and whether Louis would be required to answer them. An 11-year-old should not be performing such calculations. She performed them because no other framework had been supplied. Catherine carried a different weight and carried it largely alone. She spent evenings with Charlotte explaining that certain matters move slowly while sleeping little herself. She withheld her darkest thoughts from William in order to protect him. He did the same in return. Neither noticed that both had ceased to speak honestly. Prolonged strain between two people who love each other and each attempt to remain the stronger often produces no open conflict, no coldness that can be named. Kindness simply grows quiet and remains quiet until the household functions as two parallel operations under the same roof. Louis occupied the center of that quiet. At 8, he lacks any institutional knowledge, yet reads adult rooms with precision. He has always been the child who fills silence. Those who have followed the family in public know him as the one who cannot remain still through ceremony, the one whose expression frequently reaches the front pages in ways that would once have drawn a raised royal eyebrow. As the youngest, he has carried fewer expectations and has therefore been allowed simply to be a child. That kindness left him without any framework for understanding why he had suddenly stopped going anywhere. What he registered was not a formal decision, but a change in adult volume. The rupture occurred one night after the children had gone to bed. Catherine had written her own statement by hand over several sittings. She placed the pages on the table before her husband. Beside them sat the official palace draft, language cleared in advance so that it would say something without creating fresh questions. Such drafts are skilled work. Every clause is tested against possible meanings 6 months hence. To Catherine, the sentences were empty. They described improvement without acknowledging fear. They were carefully unfalsifiable. She could not accept them. William read the opening of her version and shook his head before reaching the second sentence. He reminded her that a public message can be replayed, dissected, and quoted back at their son for the rest of his life. He asked whether she was prepared to watch the boy discussed by people who would never meet him. His voice rose and then stopped, both of them recognizing in the same instant that the anger was fear in another form. Catherine did not retreat. She told him that Louis had begun to believe he was being kept from view because the family was ashamed of him, not because of illness, not because of any fault in him, because he had concluded at 8 that he was the one who did not go, that no one would explain why, and that conversation altered when he entered a room. A child without explanation constructs one. The construction Louis formed was that he himself was the difficulty. That was the product of a decade of careful protection inside the mind of the person it had been designed to shield. Catherine pushed the official draft aside and said there was nothing in it that resembled the boy they had nearly watched lose belief in himself. She noted that George and Charlotte had both learned to lower their voices when their brother was mentioned, that the eldest watched every closed door, that their daughter left jokes on a bed because she had discovered for herself that laughter restored him. The silence was no longer protecting one child, it was shaping all three. Then she relayed the request that ended the argument because it had not originated with her. Louis had asked, unprompted and after thought, to thank the people who had made him feel safe, to let George and Charlotte know their efforts had mattered, and above all, to prevent others from concluding he had disappeared through lack of courage. William sat down, covered his face briefly, and admitted something remarkable for a man raised from birth to maintain composure. His decisions had not concerned privacy alone. They had concerned his own fear of losing control over what happens to those he loves. That single sentence accounts for much of what he has done since 1997. That night, they reached a boundary. Catherine would speak. Private details would remain private. The pretense that the preceding months had been easy would end. One further authority retained the power to halt the process. Charles received the draft after an evening briefing and cleared the room. He read the pages twice. When he reached the line concerning a child mistaking privacy for shame, he removed his glasses and set them down for a long interval. The sentence landed on a man who has lived his entire life inside an institution that teaches restraint before its costs can be understood. He was taught it. He taught it to his sons. One of those sons has spoken publicly for 2 decades about the damage. Since the announcement of his own cancer diagnosis in February 2024, Charles has been negotiating in public how much of his condition the country is entitled to know. He read the sentence not merely as a grandfather, but as someone who has occupied the same contested ground. When William arrived, Charles asked a single question: whether the statement served Louis or merely eased the adults around him. Families in such circumstances routinely tell themselves they are protecting the child. Frequently, they are protecting themselves from difficult speech, and the child registers the difference at once. William defended his wife's judgment while conceding the risk he had carried from the first conversation. Once a recording exists, control of the narrative is lost. Reporters would reconstruct the absences, question the decisions, and search for what had been deliberately omitted. He was correct. All of it occurred. The communications team produced a safer version, shorter, calmer, and stripped of the passage in which Louis thanks those who helped him. They had excised the only line that belonged to the child. Charles rejected it. A statement emptied of the boy's meaning, he judged, would protect the institution while failing the person at its center, repeating a trade the monarchy has made poorly for a century. He approved Catherine's version on one condition: Louis must hear every word before release, not a summary, the complete text, so that he understood exactly what the country would be told and retained the power to refuse. An 8-year-old was given a formal veto over a royal statement concerning his own life, recorded in writing by the king. Catherine read the final version to him in private. He listened with uncharacteristic seriousness and corrected a single phrase. She had written that he was doing better. He preferred that people know he was getting strong again. She altered the sentence immediately. The distinction is exact. Doing better is something that happens to a patient. Getting strong again is something a person undertakes. An 8-year-old detected the passive voice and refused it without possessing the vocabulary to explain the refusal. Charles approved the revision with a handwritten note stating that truth delivered with restraint could protect the crown more honestly than silence. That note reverses a long institutional assumption that silence is the safer course. The recording was released. Catherine spoke calmly, thanked those who had cared for her son, and stated that his strength was returning. 2/3 of the way through, she cried and continued. The palace did not edit the moment. The response was immediate and larger than anticipated. Headlines appeared within the hour. Messages arrived faster than they could be processed. Coverage then turned precisely in the direction William had predicted. Timelines of appearances and absences were constructed. Old footage was placed beside the new statement. Presenters employed the phrase, "in recent spent months, in the tone that precedes speculation. One commentator reviewed ordinary pre-crisis footage, paused on the boy's face, and began analyzing a 7-year-old's expression frame by frame, attributing feelings from an afternoon 2 summers earlier. William watched. Rose reached toward the screen as if physical intervention were possible, then found the remote and switched the set off mid-sentence. To the few people present, he said 5 words that have since been repeated. "My son is not entertainment." They came from a man who had spent his adult life refusing public comment on his children. A father stood in his own sitting room with hands still half raised toward a darkened screen and named what he had just witnessed. 4 days after consenting to the statement, everything he had feared was occurring on his own television. He had been right about the consequences and wrong about the cost of the alternative. Outside the gates, another development took shape. Families began leaving handwritten blue stars along the public barrier at Windsor. Paper, cardboard, whatever was to hand. Blue became the shared color. Each carried the 3 words Louis had chosen: getting strong again. Most were not addressed to him. They were addressed to a child in hospital in Leeds, a recovering grandson, a daughter enduring a difficult year. People who came to leave a message for a prince left one for their own. The castle has witnessed celebration, mourning, and national uncertainty. The last comparable accumulation of objects at royal gates occurred in 1997, when flowers stood 10 feet deep outside Kensington, and the underlying message was accusation. 29 years later, the same public left paper stars for a boy about whom it was simply worried. The symmetry was unplanned. William would have registered it. One newspaper placed Catherine's face on the front page beneath the words, "A mother's voice," and, in smaller type, repeated Lewis's preferred phrase. The page presented the boy's effort as courage rather than fragility, and placed maternal honesty above institutional polish. On the same day, other outlets circulated the frame-by-frame analysis. Pushback existed. Commentators demanded explanation of the earlier silence and argued that a publicly funded family cannot unilaterally declare portions of its working life private. Officials replied more firmly than usual: a child's situation is not public property. The family had said enough to acknowledge events without surrendering every detail. When one phrase from the recording generated speculation, advisors recommended a second clarifying statement. Catherine refused. Further disclosure of frightening particulars would destroy the remaining privacy they had sought to protect. She had demonstrated willingness to speak. She now demonstrated willingness to stop. Those 2 acts together completed the episode. The ledger is plain. The family relinquished a protection maintained for more than a decade. Once a parent has spoken about a child in her own voice, every future silence is measured against that precedent. William has handed the press an opening he spent 10 years denying them. In return, an 8-year-old ceased to believe he was a source of shame. Reasonable people disagree on whether the exchange was justified. Some argue the boy would have outgrown the misunderstanding, and that a decade of hard-won insulation was sacrificed to a difficulty time would have resolved. The counter-argument rests on what occurred a few days later in a garden room. That conversation never appeared before a camera. A few days after the recording, William found Louis alone in the garden room. No doctors, no siblings, no staff. A chair stood nearby. William ignored it and sat on the floor so that he faced the child at the same level. He asked how Louis felt now that people knew. The boy's first answer concerned none of the public matters that had occupied the adults. He had noticed that his father stopped speaking of royal engagements whenever he entered a room. Those engagements had once sounded exciting. Helicopters, crowds, important work in other cities. Over months, the conversation vanished at his appearance. William had removed every reference deliberately, intending to spare the boy pressure about return. Louis drew the only available conclusion. Everyone had decided he would never again be strong enough to attend. Silence communicates whether one intends it or not. Then Louis said 4 words. "I heard you crying." During the worst week, he had lain awake and heard his father outside the bedroom door. He pretended sleep because he could not determine what an 8-year-old should do with a crying father, and judged that silence would be kinder. 2 realities sit inside those words. The first is a man trained from infancy to keep his face composed before the world, standing alone in a corridor of his own house at night and unable to maintain the composure. The second is a child performing quiet arithmetic about whether revelation would ease or increase his father's burden and choosing protection. He had been protecting the adult for months. The only reason the fact emerged is that the father sat on the floor and asked a genuine question. The admission broke the restraint William had carried from the beginning. He held his son and told him that bravery has never meant the absence of fear. It means speaking when silence would be easier. The argument Catherine had advanced advanced for months arrived from an entirely different direction in the voice of the child around whom the argument had turned. Louis then decided he wished to return gradually. No grand ceremony, nothing formal, something small with George and Charlotte beside him. When Catherine entered, she read both faces and understood that the household had shifted permanently. They agreed at once. No statement, no arranged appearance, no pressure of any kind until the boy himself declared readiness. He declared it in the summer. On August 1st, 2026, William and Catherine took all 3 children to the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow. The event is a matter of public record and the photographs are widely known. They attended as a family rather than as an official party. In Scotland, they hold the titles Duke and Duchess of Rothesay. None of the customary ceremony accompanied the visit. They watched the netball semi-final at the Hydro and the cycling at the Sir Chris Hoy Velodrome. Louis wore a Welsh cycling bucket hat, slightly too large, and spent much of the afternoon beneath it. He fist-bumped the game's mascot. The image circulated within hours. Nothing was staged. No advance announcement, no accompanying statement, no reference to the preceding months. They simply appeared at a sporting event with 3 children and sat among thousands of other spectators. The country recognized what it was seeing without instruction. Before they entered, Louis paused. Charlotte took one hand, George the other. Neither parent spoke. Catherine neither urged nor concealed the hesitation. She waited until he chose the moment. The 3 children went in together. William watched and understood what a year had been required to teach him. Return to normal would not mean reconstruction of the former arrangement. It would mean construction of a different one. He had measured privacy by the volume of what the family withheld, a lesson drawn from 1997 and not a foolish one. He eventually accepted that silence can keep a child physically secure while leaving him entirely alone inside it. Both conditions can exist at once. For a time, both did. Catherine learned the complementary truth. Honesty could free her son from the belief that he was a source of shame, yet it could not become licensed to surrender every private detail. She chose a recorded personal statement rather than a press release precisely because the form allowed her to speak and then to stop. The stopping mattered as much as the speaking. Charles later remarked privately that the monarchy had not been weakened. He believed it had emerged stronger for having passed through difficulty without converting the difficulty into performance. From him, the observation carries weight. The institution has long operated on the assumption that dignity and emotional honesty stand in opposition. Recent events suggest otherwise. Louis finished at the Velodrome and returned to his parents. He did not ask whether he would be permitted to attend another such event. He asked when he could return. That question is the true conclusion, not the statement, not the newspaper pages, not the stars at the gate, but a boy assuming without inquiry that there would be a next time. Catherine received a photograph of the display outside Windsor, examined it, and rested her fingers on a message written by another child. She asked that the collection be preserved for Louis rather than cleared. William read a letter from a father who had faced his own version of the same difficulty, explaining hard matters to children too young for complete truth and too old for evasion, and recognized that what his family had done had traveled well beyond the castle walls. Louis kept one star beside his bed. Its message states that he was brave even while resting. The palace responded with restraint. No campaign followed, no commemorative images, no accelerated return, no interviews, no further statement. What Catherine did was neither rebellion nor publicity. She corrected a message that fear had written and restored to her son the right to regard himself as recovering rather than broken. For the better part of a year, the family believed that love required walls of sufficient height. They emerged understanding that protection also requires listening, the admission of fear, and the occasional acceptance that an 8-year-old may be the one who identifies the error. The silence performed its function for as long as it had a function. When that function ended, only one person inside the building was prepared to say so.